Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Dunican.
And I'm Ciaran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. After a lengthy delay, we're back. Ciaran, it's very dark there. It's like it's the middle of night for you. Is it really dark in Ireland today?
Yeah.
It looks really dark.
Really dark. It's 8, what is it, 9:08, 9:15 in the morning. And it's very dark outside. Still, like it's not normally this dark at this time in the morning, but it's like extremely overcast, grey, rainy, windy day. It's like,
yeah, you can tell by the kind of the ambient light in the room.
I had to put the lamp on. Like it'd be way darker if I turned the lamp off and just open the curtains, even though it's 9:15.
I actually closed the shutters in my office here to the side to stop the sun beaming in on me because the sun's that bright and hot. But I put the ring light. But I put the ring light on in the room for a bit of light in the background. But it's yeah, man, it's we're completely opposite ends of the spectrum. I was in the ocean this morning swimming, and I was like, when I went for coffee this morning, it was 27 degrees at 6 a.m. And then I went to the ocean and we swam 2Ks. And about 1.5K in, I was like, I'm starting to feel a bit sick because the water was that warm. That's what it felt like.
Oh, so, that's for you, man.
I know, it's terrible, isn't it? So with that, I'm taking donations now for my charity. I wouldn't mind, but I was swimming in a suburb called Cottesloe, and if anybody knows Cottesloe here in Western Australia, the median house price is somewhere over $2 million. So these are the lengths and the hardship, Ciaran, I have to go to. These are the places I go to push my body. I have to go to the trenches.
I feel so sorry.
It's been so nice. Obviously we haven't caught up in a number of months because I was crazy busy with work. I was doing lots of travel. You were similar as well with lots of work on. So we didn't do much at the end of last year, but we did leave people with lots of episodes. I think 30 odd episodes that they could chew on anyway. And it was good because, well, what was good about the break over Christmas, it was a good chance to stop, reflect, take stock of what happened. It was a mental year last year. I think everybody around the world sort of had this mass reopening from COVID. I know from March of last year, just steadily increased here in terms of work and activity for me. And I think you were the same as well. So we're in a very different world now, I think 9 months on, post-COVID, but also as well, we've had lots of stuff happen in the popular media that I want to talk to you about today. But yeah, before we get into that, do you have any reflections on last year and your new year? Do you have any New Year goals? Or are you that way inclined? Did you have anything you thought about over Christmas that maybe I'll do this different next year?
Well, one that I was just discussing with a colleague of mine this morning who's big into training as well is just getting my body weight down to help my climbing and mountain running endeavors. So much too heavy at the moment to be able to make the most of those and to be able to enjoy them as well as I could. So I weighed in at 104.9 kilos this morning. So I'm going to be aiming closer to, aiming in closer to 96. Where I've been before when I was fighting. So and I have a big frame, like I'm like 6'2", and I have a big fucking dome, and I have big wrists, and so like that's going to be very lean for me, like 96, and I've been there before. In terms of the topics, that's just kind of like the typical New Year's resolution fitness thing. Then there's some work stuff definitely that I want to dial in, and maybe education stuff as well that I'm seriously looking at, looking across the longer term. But the other part, I suppose, it's more that I've been thinking a lot about in relation to the topics that we've discussed here in the podcast around psychology, around particularly existential risk, given the fact that much of our media environment and political environment already seems to have gotten used to the notion that there's a fucking war on the edge of Europe that's still ongoing, and that the nuclear risk from that hasn't gone away, that even if the Ukrainians win and the Russian Federation has kind of a crumbling or gets destabilized, then there's all sorts of things off the back of that, like thousands of nuclear weapons may suddenly start going missing and start being solved. And, like there's it's all of a sudden like there's like the new thing. There's always the new thing, but we have a bizarre ability to get accustomed to stuff. So it's like that's what we get used to. But I suppose a big thing that I struggle with greatly, but that I need to get better at, is to strike the balance between the allotment of attention. Strike a better balance in the allotment of my attention toward what I can actually do in my own life to take care of my own garden, take care of my loved ones, take care of my future, while also realizing that there's this area of existential risk and the crossover that has with existentialism, I suppose, or the kind of meaning crisis, and that's both related to and causative of the existential risk issues that we're navigating. And that there's the potential that I might be able to contribute somehow in content production and podcasts with you, in articles, that there's something that maybe I'll be able to contribute toward in the positive. Does that so like, I don't know if I phrase that very well. Basically, that we don't make a living off the podcast. I don't make a living off my writing, and also there's no way of knowing if I ever will, and I can't bank on anything like that. But at the same time, I have an impulse and a drive toward content production, like with yourself and my own writing, especially in this orientation toward the meaning crisis in the God-shaped hole we've often discussed, and the potential crossovers that might have with the whole category of existential risk and increasing ideological extremism, the way that's going to be mingling with increasing access to exponentially powerful technology in the form of biotech, drones, even homemade drone explosive weapons, fucking all sorts of technological innovations are going to make the ideological extremism and kind of like existential nihilism much more dangerous factors at play. But then also realizing that I have family, I have jobs, I have work responsibilities, that if I don't take, that's the priority. Yeah. Because if I'm not taking care of the people I love, and I'm not taking care of my future self, and I'm not taking care of the clients and the athletes that I work with, and then I have a responsibility toward taking care of as well as possible, then what's the fucking point in saving the world anyway? Like, there's no fucking point.
Yeah.
So it's like there's a balance. That's something that I want to get better at in terms of the allotment of my attention.
I think this is a really interesting crossover because like a bit like a Venn diagram, we have some overlapping areas. First of all, you want to lose some weight. I've actually gained weight. So in the last probably 2 months, I've gained about 4 kilos just from doing more calisthenics and more weights. And probably since we got into Nietzsche last year, I said to you that basically Nietzsche makes me want to fucking lift weights and just go, yeah. And that's what it's done, you know? And I've sort of been more doing that and doing more grappling. And over Christmas, I was very much doing just grappling, swimming, and meditation. And it was really that kind of balance, that yin and yang. It was going from the soft to the hard. And I found it really good. And then in between, I was lifting weights for my mind. I was doing lots of reading. And that's what I view the reading as weights for the mind. But I think like you, I have a similar kind of goal this year where I actually want to work less to free me up to do things that I like more, such as this podcast, reading more philosophy, more things in this area. I really want to dial down my work in 2023. So I've actually set the goal of not exceeding 40 hours a week. And if I do, then I have to give it back to myself the following week, because I was getting up to like 60, 65 hours plus travel. And it was just not tenable. And I was having like nearly panic attacks at the end of last year. And, how much is enough in terms of chasing money and trying to grow a business, because then you just become, it's the snake eating its own tail. You just end up ruining yourself, and you're ruining your business and ruining your reputation. But I think what you talk about there, Ciaran, is interesting. It's this kind of world of poly crisis. There's constantly something going on. And it's very easy to get lost in that world of, because I think over the last year, I think it's fair to say what you've just articulated about, you're very interested in existentialism, multiple kind of crisis, a little bit of geopolitics, where the world is heading, nuclear war. And I've gone in the direction of more philosophy, theology, God, the meaning of life. That's kind of, I think, the general two paths. Would you agree? In terms of reading.
But the thing is, the existentialism that I'm interested in is that what you just described for your path. But I mean existentialism in terms of the grappling, like the philosophical kind of grappling with existence. Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, etc.
Yeah,
the existential risk stuff, I think, is both caused by and causative of the existential crisis. Those words, I think I might have used those words incorrectly, but to me they're not inseparable topics. Like, I think.
Oh, I agree. I think they're very similar. They're just two roads that are heading in the same direction to the same goal.
And I think they're not even heading in the same direction. Is that, for me, it's like the existential crisis at the basis of that's happening in the human condition with suicide, with mental health catastrophes, with the rates of depression, the rates of addiction. They're not, that crisis isn't separable from the existential risk situation. It just so happens that they both relate. They both use the word existential.
Yeah.
But existential risk is the category of threats, the category of risks that threaten the future of humanity. And the existential crisis is the fact that there's this God-shaped hole that we've often discussed, where people are finding it hard to justify the continuation of existence, and what's the fucking point, and why shouldn't I just drink every fucking day and get fucked up on and get drugs, and what's the point? Why have kids? Why blah blah? It's just like, why not just burn it all down? Even if they're just gonna, even if they're not gonna do it, they're like, fuck it, whatever. That you can't separate those two things out. And I think the existential crisis, the meaning crisis, maybe to use a phrase just as not using the word existential over and over again, the meaning crisis is, to me, totally inseparable from the existential risk crisis, because the meaning crisis, when you have this, it was, I think, my G.K. Chesterton basically had said that, had written somewhere that I come across, where it was like, when people stop believing in God, they'll start believing in anything. And I'm not advocating that people start believing in whatever they think God is, their understanding, but just to be aware that we do have, if we have there's a God-shaped vacuum more so than even a God-shaped hole, that we are religious creatures. We have an impulse toward transcendence, toward attaching ourselves to a narrative or to an understanding of reality that is bigger than we are. And if we don't have something, that's what even Tolstoy defined religion as, was that religion is how someone relates to infinity. So whatever someone's religion is how they relate to infinity.
Yeah.
And I think that the woke stuff, the diversity, equality, inclusion kind of dogma is it's religious. It's
of course, it is
extremely religious. Similarly with the like militant veganism, similarly with like this extreme
crossfitters. There's all different cults that people go to. I think this is really interesting, Ciaran, because I was speaking about this the other day about, I was saying how I don't like to go to yoga classes anymore, because it ends up this kind of spiritual indoctrination at the start of it, or a 21-year-old girl or guy who starts telling me how to live my life. And I'm like, I don't want this. This is not India. This is not Hinduism. I don't want this whole like thing about it. But like my wife said to me, maybe some people go for that. Maybe that's what they need. Maybe that's like their religion. And I was like, I never really thought of it like that. I just thought going to yoga was good for stretching and feeling good. Like you're flossing out your joints. So, and it really bugs me, like that's like that. But that's my kind of shit and my hang up. But other people, to what you're saying, are going to these places for this quasi type religious experience, veganism, CrossFit, even jujitsu or boxing or whatever it might be. People become fanatical about these type of things. And then that's, and you see it with people at jujitsu, blue belts or people at a few years. Oh, jujitsu's everything. Jujitsu's life. Well, fucking boxing's life then. Soccer's life. You can see everything and everything, So I think you're right. I think people look for this meaning, like what John Vervaeke said about the meaning crisis. I think people will look for this meaning elsewhere and they'll find it. And the problem is, like, what are they going to worship, like you were saying? And we've seen that, one of the topics probably on discussion today was this post-pandemic world. We've seen that during the pandemic. And people still love it. People are mad for it to still go on, to rage on.
It simplifies life. Like,
yeah.
But I think where the difference is with something like boxing or jiu-jitsu, like you can have jiu-jitsu people that are mad, that really are like almost kind of sound like religious preachers to be like encouraging other people to do jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
But the difference is that's not the kind of thing that can destroy an economy, destroy an education system,
that's
ideologically infest children. It's like, whereas if you have bizarre environmental extremist carbon tunnel vision that wants to start blaming burping ruminants for melting icebergs and wants to destroy the farming sector because it's also wrapped up with an ideological view of nutrition that sees meat as the cause of all evil. And then it's like, oh, well, if meat is bad for you anyway, then what harm if we stop farming animals and we start, let's eat bugs and peasants, eat bugs and fucking plants, eat peasants. Like bug protein for ye fucking peasants, like this kind of like, we don't need meat anyway. So with this totally blinkered ideological view is very different to encouraging someone to take up running, or like, running really fucking helps me. Like, it's like, I love running, or like jiu-jitsu, or like they're it's more like these kind of government policies. And this relates. And so that's what I suppose, like, this is what I mean by it's like the quasi-religious nature of it. There's an element of it's attempting to kind of impose it on society. Like, you even see it with this from just the vegan thing. Just use an example in terms of religious indoctrination. You even see this bizarre, and it's something I don't know if we talked to Rob Wolf about this, but I know he's discussed this kind of thing elsewhere, and I've come across it again recently in relation to reading up on some environmentalism stuff and nutrition stuff, where there's this attempt to this kind of anti-meat drive and this attempt to even try and get people in developing countries to not eat meat, and saying that eating meat is bad, basically saying that there's some places where it totally contradicts social justice issues, where there are countries where the only thing women can own is livestock. So to then say that they shouldn't be consuming animal products or eating animals basically means that what the fuck are they going to do with themselves then? Like, there's like this totally myopic, blinkered, ideological extremism that's really strange. And I don't know how I won't go down the rabbit hole. I want to derail the conversation.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think you're right. We bring up some interesting points there about it. But I think in 2023, kind of like I was saying, just similar overlapping goals about exploring more of these topics and get more of I think for me, like what you were saying, is get more of a balance this year. So, not overworking in one direction or the other, and keeping everything kind of current and lively enough where you can keep that momentum across the year and get into all these different topics. I've been getting into some really interesting topics lately, which we'll probably talk about, but Rudolf Steiner is one of them. Ludwig Wittgenstein is another. I've been reading a massive book by Jennifer Wint on dreaming. I've been doing a lot of stuff on dreaming and sort of mystic relationships. Rudolf Steiner has got a book on this as well. I've been reading stuff I'm reading a book called God is an Anatomy. And I've been going down a few other rabbit holes. But I really want to get your thoughts on a few current affair episodes, Ciaran, that occurred over Christmas and late last year.
Preface the current affair stuff. When you use the word current there, this is actually something that this is actually something else that I meant to say around this year, is that is that and this is a lesson, all the kind of also the balance kind of stuff where you used the phrase earlier on, the poly crisis. And I quite like that, because the way the phrase I come across was the meta crisis was one, which is that there's just, it's a, and it relates to the kind of the crisis behind all the crises.
Yeah.
But like what's, and this is actually what I'm most interested in. And it's what I'm actually thinking about any time that I can put toward, or most of the time that I can put toward endeavors and pursuits and podcasts and writing outside of my actual work. I'm much more inclined towards looking at the deeper topics that are actually upstream of all these other issues.
Yeah.
So, because there'll always be a new thing, there'll always be a new bit of drama, there'll always be, whereas what's underneath it is what's far more interesting to me, like the evergreen thing, like coming back to the meaning crisis, coming back to how somebody, like the Becker stuff, how does someone navigate the fact that they're going to die? How does someone deal with grief, the death of a loved one? How does someone deal with setbacks and issues in their life? And also, as a society, how do we navigate the fact that we all have different views? How do we ensure that we develop and maintain a culture of the toleration of dissent and heterodox viewpoints? Because those are the things, a personal relationship to reality and a personal relationship to opposing viewpoints. Those are two areas, just two, but they're two that, if they're two things that, and they relate, of course, but if they're two issues that if can be grappled with and highlighted, and, or not highlighted, but yeah, grappled with, that can help all these other issues to be addressed. You know, it becomes much easier then to be able to navigate problems and topics, no matter what it is, whether it's weird, bizarre, woke indoctrination of kids, or whether it be environmental stuff or war stuff or political differences, etc. So it's like I'm becoming more interested in less and less. I actually find current affairs to be increasingly distracting from the meta crisis, I suppose. So like the poly crisis has originated from the meta crisis, I suppose, as a way.
I was just gonna say that I think the poly crisis is because of the meta crisis, and I think this is a nice way of framing this actually today. Is let's talk about, and actually let me just say this before we delve into some of these topics, because this is a nice way of reverse engineering, because what we have is current affairs are symptoms. They're symptoms, right? So current affairs are symptoms, right? The signs are what we kind of see happening, maybe not in the current affair, but maybe we see from reading, writing, listening to podcasts, we're seeing those type of signs. Classic example was years ago, you know, you might have heard people like Jonathan Haidt talk about depression, anxiety in teens and what was happening. We might have saw a little bit of this kind of woke culture starting, you know, 7 or 8 years ago. And people are like, yeah, it's just a few little kind of things. But they were the signs. And now we have the symptoms, right? So we have the signs and with the symptoms and ramifications in society. Those then are intertwined. We could even call those like they're symptoms of all these polycrises. And the polycrisis could be like Ukraine, COVID, woke wars, whatever you might want to call it. And then the meta crisis behind that might be the meaning crisis, like what you were saying, the God-shaped filled hole, as examples, right? So what you're talking about there, Ciaran, is not focusing on the symptoms down the causal chain, or what we might talk about in industry, about incident investigation. We're not looking at the consequences. We're looking for the root cause of the problem. And that's what we need to be focusing on. But I think it's good to focus on the root cause or the meta crisis, or to focus on really where these things are stemming from, because until you do, you're never going to have any change. Or if we can't even isolate what that problem is and understand what the actual problem is, you know. So I think what you're trying to do here, similar to what I would be trying to do, is trying to apply some kind of scientific engineering logic to philosophical questions, try and isolate the problem, because I think a lot of times we don't even know what the problem is, but we need not to focus on the symptoms. But one of the symptoms that
not necessarily need not to focus on the symptoms, but to recognize that there will continue to be dramatic symptoms,
Yeah.
and that those symptoms will continue to be very attention drawing and may very well distract us from analyzing or addressing or trying to identify the upstream causes, or to use your analogy of signs and symptoms, the disease itself.
Yeah.
You know, that's the what is the thing, what is the disease itself. And if we just keep addressing symptoms without addressing the cause of the disease or what the disease is, then we're just going to keep basically batting down things as they pop without
Like
understanding what's happening.
whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. And
it's so easy to be distracted. Like I spent a week away there at a training camp, and I stayed away from current affairs. What little bit of reading and writing I did do was in relation to deeper topics. I got some phenomenal writing done at the end of the week. I didn't have much time, but I got some phenomenal writing done, and the sense of peace and clarity that I had, given the fact that I just shut down the amount of topics I allowed myself to navigate because I had very limited time to do anything outside of work. It was a really wonderful reminder of what it's like to be able to put the blinkers on and not be distracted.
Yeah.
And to just zone in on something and just grapple with one thing. It was so nice. And it's not that I'm going to abandon current affairs. It's just that there'll always be a new thing, you know?
Yeah, of course. And I think, but I was going to say, I think that's part of the. Go ahead, go on.
No, I just want to point. The last point was just in relation to the meta crisis, that like the likes of McGilchrist would have, like, two examples that spring to mind of people that are very interesting to me, obviously, and yourself as well, is Ian McGilchrist, where his kind of hypothesis along the orientation that to just use the language you've already been discussing, and I don't want to misquote him, but I'll use just the basic premise is that the kind of shift, or the meta crisis, is strongly related to the fact that we're viewing the world with left brain dominance in terms of isolated, differentiated things that are categorized and separated from each other. And we're losing the ability to see into relation, interconnection, interdependence between all things, which would be more of a right brain temperament or leaning. Another potential part, another person that I've been finding really interesting of late is Bernardo Kastrup, who's a guy with 2 PhDs, worked in CERN as a kind of, I think, in artificial intelligence or computer science, and then also got a PhD in philosophy. And a major upstream cause he sees is that we're actually our understanding of reality in the Western world is incorrect in terms of the use of materialism or physicalism as a foundation, where he sees consciousness itself as the foundation of reality, and that there is only mind. So I don't necessarily, I'm still grappling with his ideas, but he can definitely argue them very well.
Bernardo Kastrup,
yeah. And his ideas crossed over a lot with Donald Hoffman, but who's another kind of, he's maybe Stanford or Berkeley neuroscientist, cognitive neuroscience. But yeah, so those are the things that because it is so easy to get caught up with the current affairs. And not that I don't want to talk about current affairs, but it just so happens to be that's something that is a major goal of mine for this year, is to just go upstream. How far upstream can we go?
I think on this topic, actually, some of my scientific work is going to start delving into this area. So obviously, we had Rachel Menzies on last year, talking about her book Mortals. On my podcast, we had Haley Meeklem on talking about dreams. And there's another friend of mine, David Cunnington, who's a sleep physician. So we got a sleep physician, clinical psychologist for insomnia, clinical psychologist on death anxiety, influenced by Becker's work, and then myself in the middle, Mr. Numpty. And we have this project now where we're currently writing up the ethics. We've agreed on the methodology. We've had a series of meetings over the last 3 or 4 months. We've put together our survey tool. And basically what we're going to do now, Ciaran, this week we've commenced writing the ethics, and we hope to submit the ethics by the end of the month. And we hope to go live then within 6 to 8 weeks from that. And we're going to do a global study. And basically what we're looking at is the relationship between dreams, anxiety, and death anxiety. and if religion or spirituality is a mediating factor. So it kind of ties into the same subject area where we're looking for people without, we hypothesize that people without spirituality or religion in their life will have higher rates of anxiety, higher rates of death anxiety, and will have actually more frequency of nightmares as well, which comes back to that lack of meaning in their life from religion. And we know that here in Australia, for example, and around the world, in the Western world, that classic religion is dying. And less than 50% in most of these countries don't believe really in a God anymore. But they've diversified and started believing in these other religions that we just spoke about earlier on. So this is something on the same topic as well that we're going to try and apply some scientific rigor to. And we're hoping to study that. We're hoping to publish these actually in philosophy journals. So trying to combine a bit of this philosophy and my background in science as well, in sleep, to get into this area. Because despite what we think, despite the fact that a lot of people dream and are interested in dreaming, there's very little objective or scientific research done in dreams, really, in relation to these other relationships. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that goes in, man. It's a
really cool project. I just wrapped up 2 papers there this month that got published. One was a big review we were working on technology and stuff in athletes. It was called like pajamas and technology or something in athletes. That came out. And then we had another paper accepted on education in master swimmers. And so now that I've cleared off a few of those, it'll give me a bit more time to focus on that. And I'm currently, myself, Andy Galpin and Reid Reel are writing up a paper on combat sports, sleep and nutrition habits in combat sport athletes. We had over 1,000 people in that study. So we're currently writing that one up as well. So a few interesting ones coming out.
Now, I want to actually maybe another call or offline about that. Remind me, because I'd be deadly curious about how you're going to define religion and how you're going to ask the specific questions around religion. Because the reason I ask is that religion, when you look at religion, could even be an ideological thing where we not how we typically classify religion, because you can well have Gulag guards in communist Soviet Union that their religion is actually the Marxist-Leninist take on the world, that they're the saviors, they're the good guys, there is no God, but we're still going to make utopia eventually, and my life is going to contribute towards this Marxist-Leninist utopia.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until after, you come across this crack, it wasn't until after the camps go down and then these guards go home and then they realize that they were actually the bad guys, and they go and kill themselves.
Yeah.
So how to define it is a fascinating thing. Like, it's because if you take the looser term to describe religion, which is how does someone relate to existence, then everyone has a religion. It just so happens that some of them are Christian flavored and some of them are communist flavored or fat or Nazi flavored or whatever.
Yeah.
Not that I'm relating Christianity to communist or fascism.
The
fact that they're just relations to existence.
Well, to briefly answer your question, and we can talk about offline, is that we're going to be using a validated questionnaire that's out there already. So obviously the challenge with a lot of these type of research projects is you want to use validated or proven methods. So the more kind of wide you go with your questions, the more subjective and the more difficult it's going to become to classify them. But I do think that you do raise an interesting point about, and it's something we will have to address in the paper as well, as like what is determination or factor, what is our definition of religion and spirituality. Now, I will also say as well, and you know this as well, Ciaran, is that when you start these projects, you've got about 50 million things you want to look at. And so we had to really blinker in and isolate this. And I spoke to people in the US and across Australia about doing this stuff. We've probably got about 10 projects we want to do out of this already, but we really have to blinker in. And as the other thing I said as well on this podcast is that I'm not a funded academic. I don't work at a university. Everything is self-funded through the business. And this project has basically been self-funded by myself and David, and the other 2 people are pitching in basically our goodwill. So it's not like we have millions of dollars on hand either. But But now that you talk about communism and that sort of thing, this is a beautiful segue into, because one of the things that's grabbed my attention and worries me, and I'm just grabbing onto current affairs that are worrying me lately.
Yeah.
In terms of not so much like Not so much as if like, oh, isn't that terrible? Like, 20 people died in a plane crash, which it is. But what I'm more worried about is to me, it's like, here's the sign. And the sign I saw recently was Jordan B. Peterson, our friend who I saw here in Perth back in November, wearing his heaven and hell suit, two-tone colors, or his two-tone suit. He recently was told by the clinical psychology board in Ontario that he had to undergo social media training because of things that he retweeted and because of statements he made on the Joe Rogan podcast. Now, as a clinical psychologist, you see patients or clients, whatever the correct terminology is, I think it's clients. And not one of the complaints, or the 12 complaints that they received, which came from around the world, by the way, not people in Canada necessarily, 12 complaints made that he said, not one was a patient or a client. And these people have pitched in these complaints, and now he has to undergo social media training from an external party company with no defined criteria of when he will pass it. And it'll be up to the trainer to determine if he has basically assimilated the message. Now, to me, Ciaran, that is some Orwellian 1984, kind of retraining. What's the word? Like
Re-education.
Re-education. That's like Ministry of Love shit there. Like, what do you think about this? Because that actually terrifies me. That really scares me that they've done that. And in conjunction to that, by the way, I read an article the other day on a business website about leaders in kindness, and leaders that can lead with kindness are the way of the future. People like Justin Trudeau and Jacinta Ardern. And I'm like, man, this is even scarier. This is scary. This is scarier because they're doing it with a smile on their face, and people think that this being kind. They are mental cases, in my opinion. They are completely off the chain. So what's your thoughts on this Peterson thing?
Well, on the political thing first, this whole notion of lead with kindness, this is actually something that we hear this phrase. We've been bombarded with these phrases of like oppressive patriarchy and toxic masculinity for ages. But now we're getting a chance to see what oppressive matriarchy and toxic femininity can look like, which is this optimizing function toward like agreeableness and niceness at the expense of truth, at the expense of even acknowledging objective reality for what it is. And you can see it in, like, I used an example. Professor Anna Krylov from the University of Southern California, I believe she was, or University of Southern, maybe University of Santa Barbara, I think, I don't know, whatever. She's a really, really, really high level physical chemist.
She wrote that paper, didn't she? On what was it called?
The Perils of Politicizing Science.
Yeah.
So she was basically pointing out the ideological infestation of STEM by diversity, equality, inclusion, dogmatism, and basically pointing out that this is essentially following the same playbook and orientating in the same direction that she saw when she was living in the Soviet Union, and when the field of biology had been eviscerated by Lysenkoism. But it's not about it's the old trope. It's like, it's not the class war stuff anymore. The woke stuff has swapped out class differences for identity differences, and it's using the same playbook. So when you mention the phrase re-education, there's like these re-education camps. So it's a Soviet thing, like. So I suppose it's none of it surprising. Like the Trudeau thing as leader with kindness is like, what history does what current affairs over the last 18 months does someone have to be looking at to see Trudeau as kind? There was protesters, the vast majority of whom were actually vaccinated themselves, but were protesting vaccine mandates at a time in which it was known by any man and his dog that the vaccines didn't prevent transmission. and that Omicron was essentially a transmissible vaccine that gave most people a head cold. And they were still trying to bring in vaccine mandates, and these truckers protested it. And what did he do? He shut down their bank accounts.
Yeah.
So
and there was no violence there, Ciaran. Let's be clear. There was zero violence there.
Yeah, like that's just one example out of a litany. And so when there's this optimizing function for kindness, you're just going to get nonsense the same way that, like, so this is essentially what a toxic feminine matriarchy looks like. Toxic, or like oppressive matriarchy. This is what an oppressive matriarchy is. It's an optimization for niceness at the expense of justice, at the expense of objective truth, at the expense of acknowledging reality as it actually is, even if it's uncomfortable. It's like a good pat in the back. Let's fucking Oedipal mother you and wrap you in a blanket and protect you from the world.
That's what worries me, Ciaran.
So it's not surprising. It's like the Jordan Peterson thing. It's not surprising. Like I'm just glad that he has fuck you money and can probably launch a legal case and maybe can get something done about it. And even if he can't, he'll be all right. But it's just, as you said, it's a sign potentially of what does this look like in 4 or 5 years' time? Like I could give you an example. This is a really bleak thing that popped into my imagination, but I a few weeks ago I opened my phone, my podcast app, and I'm subscribed to us. I have so many interests, as you well know, so I'm subscribed to like 150 podcasts or something, whatever.
Jesus
on my
Christ.
app. Yeah, and I don't listen, and I always go through phases of different ones. But it's over time. Like I've listened to a lot of podcasts, and as I cracked it open one day, and then I just this realization hit me that if we throw up a podcast, it'll be online in a day or a few hours. But I open up this thing and I was like, how long more will that be the case? Like, how long more will me in Ireland or you in Australia be able to share whatever we want, whenever we want on a podcast or on YouTube? Like, because the way the trend is moving is toward information gatekeeping.
Yeah.
You know, it's not so. That was one of the most unsettling thoughts I've ever had in my life, is the fact that the way the information ecology is currently set up is a kind of a golden era, but that there's a dark age coming.
So do you think there's a couple of things in this? Because with the Peterson thing, right? People often go, oh, well, Peterson's just an anomaly. You know, he speaks out and it's just a world we live in. This happened to other people. This happened to Bertrand Russell, by the way. Bertrand Russell was offered a job. I can't remember which university. I think it was in America. Now, I want to say Berkeley, but I could be wrong. I'll have to clarify this. I'll have to find out. But Bertrand Russell was offered a job. And because he wrote a book on the morals of marriage and he spoke about rape within marriage and stuff like this, and this is back in the early 1900s. So Bertrand Russell was around from like, I think 1872 to about 1950 something or 1960, something like that. And because he wrote this book, actually, he died in 1970, sorry. Jeez, he was nearly 100. People were outraged about this book. People were outraged, Ciaran, who didn't have kids going to the university. There was people who made those complaints. And one specific male went to the newspapers in New York about this because he had a daughter who was like 5 or 6 years of age. So this has been happening forever, where people, you know, in different epochs or eras of time, when we had newspaper, then we had radio and TV, and now we have internet. And I think there's always been this constantly in those eras. There's been this like lots of information, and then there's been like a hampering or a dialing down of it, or a curation of it, to your point. But I wonder as well, will it get to that point where this will not be allowed? And I hope it doesn't. And you know what gives me some solace that it won't is Elon Musk. Because Elon Musk on Twitter is allowing people to basically do whatever they want. He is true free speech. And I think maybe people like him, and I think that's why a lot of people don't like him, is he's just allowing the game to be completely open. Whereas you get these other people like Andrew Tate getting around talking about the Matrix. And in some ways you look at the world like that and you go, maybe it is all like a Matrix. It's controlled and we're all in different lanes and sections and things are going on. But then you look at Musk and you think, How long is it before he gets Clinton? Or even Andrew Tate. So I don't know. I don't know. It's interesting. I hope it's not like that. I hope information
There
becomes.
are signs, like there are signs. Like I'm not despairing with nihilism. Like that thought that I had was real in terms of it was viscerally extremely discomforting to think about that possibility. The other side of it is there are signs for hope as well. You know, I push back against the woke stuff, for example, which relates to all this kind of free speech stuff and this ability to exchange information. Is that even in the UK, you had some recent legal cases and revelations that made the news finally around these organizations that were essentially indoctrinating kids and facilitating medical transitions with kids who just were like autistic and had a whole litany of other disorders, and then we're basically told, oh yeah, that's because you're trans and here's some testosterone and go away there and get your breast cut off. You'll be grand. You know, you're not only going to be grand, you're going to be special if you get your double mastectomy and take testosterone at 16. So it's like there's Musk, of course, then there's like Substack, there's a success of Substack, which is also really cool because they're facilitating it. But yeah, it's like the big concern is the orient. So I'll give you an example of I read do you know that app Telegram?
Yeah.
Do you hear about it?
Yeah. I'm on it. Yeah. Sorry. I'm only on it because I'm a far right racist. Because last year during the pandemic, or about 18 months ago, Telegram was a far right racist app.
Yeah. But this is what I read some articles where basically there was German politicians basically talking about this banning Telegram in Germany. And what was concerning about that was the fact that, look, they're banning this app because people are exchanging information that they can't control what's being shared, but obviously. But then there's also only a few years before that, because I'm sure there is dangerous, fucked up shit being shared and people selling child porn or guns or fucking sex slaves or whatever. That's probably happening because any way of sharing information that can be anonymous and you can set up encrypted chats that can't be hacked and you commit of course fucked up shit is going to go down, but the benefits might outweigh the costs, because only a few years before that Telegram was like this wonder app because it was being used by the Hong Kong protesters to organize, because the CCP couldn't do anything about it in 2019 when the big protest broke out. Wonder app because it was being used by Belarusian protesters to protest against your man Lukashenko, because they couldn't do anything about it. And these protesters could actually use this app and organize and maintain a sense of anonymity and organize quickly to move protests around to avoid the army and the armed police, etc. So it's like, then when you have this orientation of Western liberal open democracies, open societies, moving in the direction of authoritarian or totalitarian states in the desire to control information exchange because of a fear of some boogeymen, that's a very concerning event. And you can't help but think, like, to look on the dark side of it, or like the pessimistic side of it, the next emergency is an excuse to clamp down on information exchange. So the next pandemic or the next terrorist attack or the next
bushfire or climate change or anything.
And so it's like, I just find it like this is where like the kind of the upstream issues kind of draw me more, is that like it's like the fact that there isn't a widespread understanding that in the absence of the free exchange of information, we lose the ability to correct errors. We lose the ability to correct course. That is the lifeblood of an open society, or you can even just say Western civilization itself, because Western civilization is built upon two pillars. The more kind of Jerusalem-based pillar, which is the notion that every human being is sacred, regardless, even if they're a murderer, there's still an element of sacredness to even the person who does the worst stuff. And the love your enemy notion. And there's also, it's built on a kind of the more Athenian pillar, which is based around decentralized error correction through reason and rationality and a respect for evidence and objective fact and empiricism. And that's like science, democracy, rule of law, that et cetera, et cetera. It's the ability to correct errors. And the tighter the feedback loop that we can correct errors, the faster we can correct course, the less harm that can be done. So when we have an inability to exchange information, like I give an example, like in Africa, you'd probably be able to discuss this more than me from a mining perspective. African countries, people in Africa are much happier to see an American or an Australian or a British mining company come in and start mining or drilling than they are to see a Chinese company come in. Why? Because if something goes wrong and there's a big spill and there's a load of toxins released into an environment or something happens, or there's a human rights violation or there's fucked up labor practices, the American or the Australian or the British company can be held accountable by a press and a legal system in their countries. Whereas in China, the information ecosystem is tightly controlled. No one will ever find out about it. There's no pressure. The government doesn't give a fuck what happens there as long as it doesn't happen over there, because they actually have Chinese Communist Party members on the boards of these companies or involved in the management of these companies, these big Chinese companies.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So they don't give a shit because they can't, Chinese people can't even get access to the fact that some oil company or some drilling company has child labor and mines collapse on top of people and fucking spills happen and toxins are released and estuaries are destroyed or whatever, and that can't be discovered. Even if they could discover it, they can't do anything about it because they don't have such things as ballot boxes in China because it's a fucking communist dictatorship. So, but what's the foundation is the ability to freely exchange information, because who knows how long that. So that's the kind of upstream thing that I'm really interested in relation to any of this stuff. Like, is the ability to freely exchange information and take with that the costs that provides, that comes with that, which is the ability for unpleasant people to say unpleasant things, the ability for dangerous people to share dangerous information about potentially how to make weapons, how to be able to find weak spots in infrastructure or whatever to do terrorist attacks. You have to accept the bad with the good, because as soon as that good is lost, all is lost. Because
Ciaran,
can't exchange information, we're fucked.
Yeah, and I think you're dead right. And I think one of the things like is interesting is like when people bang on about, oh, it was so good, like, you know, that Trump was taken off Twitter because of what he was saying. Well, how the fuck can you say that and then be okay with the Taliban being on Twitter? Like,
yeah, or the CCP.
Or CCP. Like, if you're going to apply a rule, apply it evenly and fairly. But don't it's just cherry pick, like, oh, he really annoys me. Like, okay, but if that was the case, he'd walk down the road every day and go, right, the guy in number 39, get fucking rid of him, burn him out. The guy in 25, shoot him. Everyone's going to annoy you. Fuck me, I annoy myself some days. Like, you know, everybody's going to annoy somebody. So it's weird.
The woke don't know what to do with unpleasant non-white people.
Well, they won't even have a discussion, first of all. If you look at most people, like I watch those two, and I don't know if they identify as male or female or gender neutral or whatever, those two, I'm going to say ladies, girls, I don't know, because that's what I think they were. They were on Patrick Bet-David's podcast, the ones that threw the soup on the pitcher over climate change a few months ago. They were on Patrick Bet-David's podcast, and they were just talking fucking nonsense. And just this tone of, and they really believe the world is going to collapse tomorrow. And they think that throwing soup on a pitcher is like the way to go forward. It's just, I just don't understand it. I really don't.
It's not surprising that they think that, like, because the media ecosystem doesn't tolerate dissent on that. Like, there's the new podcast recently. Like, I really like, you know, like Bjorn Lomborg.
Yeah.
Your man Alex Epstein, Michael Schellenberger in particular. I haven't read Lomborg's book now or Epstein's book, Fossil Fuel. I listened to a bunch of podcasts, but I have Michael Schellenberger, his book Apocalypse Never. But then they had the Peterson recently had a podcast with man, Richard Linzin, I think his name is, I read some of his stuff before, never any of his books, but some papers, who's basically has a very heterodox stance on climate, and he has for decades. And he's an MIT professor who retired in 2013. But he basically said that you can't get funding from the National Science Foundation or any if your opinions or if your research orientation or your opinions question the standard narrative on climate. So how then can we trust the standard narrative on climate if research isn't being funded to find out where that narrative might be wrong?
Yeah.
If they're only willing to research things that will already support what they think, then that's no longer science.
Yeah, it's biased.
Science requires the collective attempt to falsify conjecture.
Yeah.
And a social endeavor. It's like it's decentralized social error correction. It's a social technology. And if we can't find out, if we're not trying to find out where we're wrong, then we can no longer trust what opinions are currently held as the most likely view of reality. So it's not so if you can question that narrative in the highest levels of science, and if people are losing their jobs or people are editors, he talked about 2 editors in prestigious journals who lost their jobs after approving two separate occasions papers that he wrote that question the standard narrative on climate. It's not that he denies carbon plays a role in that. He's just basically pointing out the scale of they're operating on the wrong scales, that he kind of thinks more that any particularly dangerous stuff that's going to happen from climates thousands of years away, and that there was medieval warming periods where you could grow fucking grapes in England and make wine in England. These are actual historical events. And he's like, of course carbon plays a role. You're not going to deny that. No physicist worth his salt is going to deny that. But you have to look at what impact it's going to have, etc. So that kind of that kind of view, that's not just this myopic, blinkered, burping cattle or melting icebergs, we all have to stop growing cars and ride a bicycle and be a vegan and eat bugs, you fucking peasant. That viewpoint, that's like, the bug thing is bugging me, pardon the pun, because it's just this notion of when we eat bug protein is going to save the world. But this if that's the case, that's filtering all the way down through, because that's what makes it to the media. That's what's making it. I don't even know, there was an article on the front page of the Irish Times yesterday that basically was saying that the Irish government are planning on taking in more climate migrants, that we can't say no to climate migrants, people who have to leave because their place is no longer inhabitable. But who decides how do you demarcate which place is uninhabitable because of human impact, climate change? Like, how do you figure that out? Like, and then it just, the whole thing is it's tapping into a religious structure. So then that's feeding all the way down the chain, where you have toddlers and you have children being taught that the world is fucked and that that everything is fucked because of their parents are driving cars instead of riding bicycles. And it's not surprising that there's such fear and anxiety amongst young people if they're only getting exposed to one argument ramped up to 11 all the time. And there's these COP26, COP27 circuses. There's this COP thing every year where thousands of people fly in private jets.
Yeah,
and jump
it's
up
ironic.
Yeah, it's unbelievably silly. Like,
yeah,
and I just find that the whole, like, it's not surprising that there's so much sadness and anxiety and fear and regurgitation of sound bites when there's only one ideological narrative throughout the whole information ecosystem, unless you happen to come across something that's managed to get through the filter.
I think we might have a perfect storm or a confluence of factors here, Ciaran, that's leading to this, because you mentioned like the scientific method. I think the scientific method has been under attack by itself for a number of years, where we see in the scientific sort of, world that papers are just being published like crazy now. There was something I read the other day. It was like, if Einstein was around today, his H index, which is a measure of his publications and citations, wouldn't be enough for him to get tenure. So basically he wasn't publishing enough, right? And so you see now people pumping out papers left, right, and center because that's what the game is. The game is actually
Publish or perish.
publish or perish. So it's basically just about pumping out papers, right? So it's not really on true scientific work and deep thinking and in the lab and looking for an answer and, you know, having that kind of eureka moment where you spend 4 or 5 years.
It's not about solving problems.
It's not about solving problems. It's about just pumping out
boxes.
Yeah, ticking boxes and pumping out
shit. Get the ideological gatekeepers happy.
Yeah.
Keep the administrators happy. Get funding.
Yeah.
Keep the head down.
See, people look at
science is over if that's the case. Like.
But people are looking at, like, you know, Good Will Hunting or other movies, and they think that people are walking around with elbow patches, chewing on a pencil and thinking about the world. They're not. They're fucking under the pump trying to pump out these papers. And if you look at PubMed or Google Scholar, if you take out those papers, I think something like 99% of people don't even get cited. The 1% of people, then I think there's like mainly they cite themselves, and then there's like a fraction that actually gets cited again. And so that's one part of the problem. So we see that happening. It's a drastically positive bias in terms of publications, like positive findings. I think it's like 90 to 95%. So very little negative findings in any discipline, even not just climate change. That's been happening for a long time. Then you have this whole meaning crisis that you spoke about as well, the lack of God, the lack of meaning. Kids are getting raised with this as well now, less religion at home, less spirituality. And on top of that, now you've got the woke culture stuff happening, like you've spoken about. You've got the meta crisis, as we just spoke about as well. So you've got this perfect confluence of factors. But then what we've seen on top of it, which to me is like the sprinkles on top of this cake, is that the leaders of the world, given that COP26 and all these things, are quite happy to basically go out there and be, you know, I don't know, completely, what's the word? Like, just, I can't think of the word that comes to, there's no word that comes to mind, but they just basically contradict themselves in terms of flying these private jets and doing these different things, telling people what to do, like Gavin Newsom, no dining indoors and outdoors and all that, but he's outside with a fucking chandelier, he's really inside. You know, all these rules. It's that classic, nearly like Animal Farm, where, you know, some pigs are more equal than others in George Orwell's novel, which, you know, as Peterson says, some fiction is truer than truth. And that for fucking was sure with that book. And we're starting to see that now. We're starting to see this kind of like, you know, Trudeau and Jacinta Ardern and, you know, Mark McGowan here in Western Australia. They're talking in this kind of tone, like they're some sort of fucking robot. And they're sprinkled across top of all of this. And it's like a perfect storm of all of these things happening. And now we have Putin out there, like the big bad wicked witch of the East. You know, he's something to rail against. We've got Zelensky jumping up and down like a puppet on strings. We've got all these things happening in the poly crisis. I just wonder, is it a perfect confluence of all these factors that's just completely exacerbated by the use of the internet? And it wouldn't be this bad if it happened 50 years ago. I just feel we've hit this perfect like nexus, this perfect spot where everything's just gone fucking boom. And COVID was like the gasoline on the fire. It was like fucking pile it on. And then as COVID was dissipating, someone went, go get more fuel. Oh, here's one, Ukraine, fucking throw that on. Boom. And now we have this big fire burning. And you see people on their Twitter profiles that have a mask, syringes, and a Ukraine flag and a ABC LGBTQI flag. Yeah. And you're like, rainbow flag. What is going on? Like, why do we have to virtue signal every turn? Like, who cares? And if you're not on that bandwagon, Twitter, you're fucked.
I changed my Twitter thing the other because I just saw a load of that shit, and I was just, I think what's in my Twitter bio is, I think I wrote, infinitely ignorant, potentially villainous primate. That's my Twitter bio.
I'm going to change mine because lots of academics or adjunct academics have like views are my own. So like they're not being associated with the university. I'm going to write in mine, I do not believe in free will. These thoughts are coming from a being from outer space. Like I'm going to put in something like that because it's just fucking like it's like these camps of people have all the same thing replicated over and over and over again. It's just, you know, it's just unbelievable.
The other side of it, though, like it may very well be the case that the internet does a great job of turning mountains into molehills, and that feeding extremism and feeding extremism and feeding like kind of facilitating indoctrination, etc., in certain ideologies. But the other side of it is that I think you mentioned jiu-jitsu earlier on. Like, actually, I give an example with Iran, right? So like Iran, obviously for decades now hates America as the satanic Americans, etc. But they love wrestling, like not WWE fucking
No,
fake wrestling.
they're proper wrestling. Yeah. Yeah.
Proper wrestling. They absolutely love Jordan Burroughs, the American wrestler.
Yeah, Jordan Burroughs. Yeah.
They love Jordan Burroughs. So even though they hate America, they love Burroughs because he's a wrestler. And I think that this is one of the benefits of the internet is the fact that it's allowing people all over the world to see each other as people if they can see them through the lens of something that they themselves like to do. So they get a chance to watch, like racist lads might get a chance to see like black soccer players that they may or may not like, but they just get a chance to see him on fucking Instagram with his kids or whatever, and just see a human. Like similarly, like or anyone who doesn't like, or Chinese lads see, or anyone, or American guys seeing Chinese athletes lifting weights or whatever. Just the fact that it's sport, obviously, is the examples I use there, but it could be across any domain, that it just facilitates the ability to recognize shared humanity. That it's much harder to caricature people. Like if you look at like the First World War, Second World War, First World War in particular, is that it's very easy to demonize easy to demonize the opposition and to view them as just these evil, whatever, pick your dehumanized lizards or rats or whatever, and go out there. And there was actually some medieval art from back in the day, 1,000 years ago, of the Crusades, where it had these British knights, with the crosses and stuff like that. It might be French, but the Arabs that they were fighting had the headscarves on, but had like these lizard or snake heads but human bodies, totally dehumanizing. This is just this kind of like big tapestry or art or whatever, just basically pointing out that as it's the case for there to be ideological extremism and polarization and the sharing of mad views, there's also the case where I think, and much more so, there's much more humanization of people taking place across borders, across identity characteristics, across nationalities, religions, etc. That it's very easy to focus on the bad stuff because of negativity bias that we have, where we're just wired to hone in on what makes us afraid or anxious. But I actually have, even though I was very pessimistic in a lot of the discussion and kind of focusing more on the worrisome aspects of the future, I also genuinely have a lot of hope as well. And there's a lot of signs for positivity and even if I'm naive, what else is there to do but focus on the reasons to keep the show on the road. And if I just like to bring it kind of full circle, there's a brilliant phrase I heard recently, which is that in order to save the world, you must first savor the world.
I like that.
Yeah. Because how much of the like eco extremists or how many of them actually genuinely are operating, the extremists, I mean, they were the most vocal and aggressive, are genuinely coming from a place, or those two girls you mentioned who kind of threw shit at the painting. Like how many, do either of them, they may very well, but do either of them spend time in wild nature and genuinely appreciate the beauty of a wild place or of even a nice garden, even if it's not wild, and just are able to sit by themselves for 10 minutes or half an hour and just pay attention to the contents of their own mind, or sit by a stream just to sit there.
Or even what you said, Ciaran, about basically, in some countries, women can only own livestock or mine in Africa. Like, do people understand the ramifications? Like, it might be very well to come up with these actions of, throwing soup and to raise, basically a bit of hysteria about a problem and then communicate that to the media. But do they really understand the ramifications of what they want? Because if they want, no animals to be killed and they want, action on climate change and whatever it is, how's that going to affect? They're assuming that every action is going to have a positive impact. That is naive. And we know that, and I can tell you now, as I get older, I realize that. And it gets back to what we spoke about last year with Nietzsche. It's beyond good and evil. And sometimes you might do a positive action in one place, and then, it has a negative outcome. And I always use the Carl Pilkington quote. You know Carl Pilkington? Ricky Gervais, the comedian? I always use him to illustrate this point. Because they were talking about, I think it was on the Guide to Medicine or something, or one of these things. And Ricky Gervais said to him, like, about solving problems. And Carl goes, no point in solving problems. And Ricky was like, what are you talking about? He's getting on mad at him. And Carl goes, a problem solved is a problem created. Ricky's like, what are you fucking talking about? And Steve Merchant was like, you're crazy, Carl. What are you talking about? He goes, listen, right, I'll give you an example. He goes, NHS, in a bit of bother recently, not enough beds. Ricky's like, yeah, get more beds then. Ricky's gone, yeah, you get more beds. Carl goes, next problem, not enough pillows. so you think, like, and I know it's a silly example and it's a joke, right? Obviously comedians, but it's a great example of, like, I solved that problem, but then it creates another one. And if you follow that logic with the beds, it's very simple. But you go, okay, now we need more pillows, more sheets, more people to clean the sheets. Now it's not just about having more beds, we actually need more infrastructure for the beds. So where's that money going to come from? Now we need more cleaners, more food, and so on. So the ramifications of, we just think that if we don't have enough beds for a hospital, we just get more beds. But when we truly start looking at the ramifications or the impact of our altruistic or positive actions, it may end up being a negative. And that's where I think sometimes these people, and it seems to me that these two young girls, Phoebe Plummer and Anna Holland are their name, it seems to me they look like they're, somewhat middle to upper middle class English ladies who have that luxury. And if we want to talk about privilege, now is a perfect time to talk about privilege. Because if you're in that situation, you have the privilege of going and doing that. So you're not the oppressed here.
But they also had, like, were they talking about veganism and stuff for that?
I think it was.
You mentioned it about not killing animals. I don't know. I didn't listen to it or anything, so I don't know.
It was climate change predominantly, but I think on the Patrick Bet-David thing, they did speak about. I don't know if they were vegan so much. They were more about, but just I think they were talking about animals in terms of, like, what you were saying, the burping and the farting leading to climate change. I think it was more about that.
Because I could give an example. I think on the problems thing, I think the idea is not to get rid of problems, but the idea is to get better problems. So, like, if you actually need more beds, then even if you don't have pillows, it's better to be on a bed, not have a pillow, than to be on the floor on a couch, on like plastic chairs in the waiting room of the hospital.
That's correct. So that's true. Yeah.
But, like, it's better. It's like, it's actually, this is one of my favorite books, is called The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch, and the way he describes it, that there's that every problem creates new problems, but the idea is to get better problems. Not to, so I like that, but I think the point, if I use an example, if you look at natural disasters, so if you look at what they were protesting about the drilling in England off the coast of Britain, let's say they were protesting of, like, mining and oil and stuff like that off. I don't know if it's off the coast or on land, but basically drilling in England or in UK, sorry. And the thing is, if you don't have your own energy security, then you're subject to the whims of Vladimir Putin and his gas pipes. You're subject to the whims of dictatorships in Qatar or Saudi Arabia and their fossil fuels. Because now what? So if you're not going to have your own energy security, because you do require fossil fuels to run an economy, that's undeniable. We can't. Otherwise, you can't. There's anyone who says otherwise is in dreamland in terms of today, like the next 10 years, next century, next 2 centuries, maybe, who knows? But we have to eventually get past fossil fuels because they are a finite resource. So you do eventually have to have renewables or shift towards more advanced, like nuclear or whatever. But still, right now, over the coming decades, we require loads of fossil fuels. So where is that going to come from? So like, oh, we don't want to be the ones that drills it up because it's bad for the environment. Okay, but where's it going to come from? Oh, we're going to have to buy its all from Russia. Or what does that mean? Well, he has Europe by the balls, so he's not afraid to fucking invade Ukraine. Or you end up with funding dictatorships in the Middle East that are chopping people's hands off and putting women's rights activists in prison for wanting to drive cars, and torturing and raping them in prison for wanting to drive cars, or decapitating people on Friday after Mass.
We don't want to talk about those problems, Ciaran. They're not in the media, you see, and they're not the symptoms that we really want to talk about. They're not the real problems that we should be talking about.
But that's the thing. It's like these unintended consequences are very real. Like I read a brilliant piece in Spiked recently called "The West's Eco-Imperialism" or something. It was called. It was written by this guy from Ralph Stallhammer, I think his name is, from the University of Vienna, and he was basically saying that he was describing John Kerry going to the African Union and basically flying in a private jet, of course, and then eventually when he got there, pointing out to the African Union that they need to shift to renewables and that they shouldn't drill for the gas, the huge resources, gas and resources that they have, because it's bad for the environment. And I can't remember the guy's name. The president of Senegal, who was also the president of the African Union, said, "Listen, mate, no country has ever developed economically off the back of renewables, and it will not happen. It can't happen in Africa. So thanks for your input, but fuck off." Basically, was the
that's exactly what he said verbatim.
Yeah. So
Ciaran was in the room.
But that was the sentiment, because who the fuck is John Kerry to fly in a private jet and tell these African countries that they have to buy expensive, unreliable energy sources in the form of renewables when they're sitting on enormous fossil fuel resources that could be used to develop their countries and drag them out of poverty and build infrastructure, health systems, education systems? Like, who the fuck is the West to tell developing countries that they can't pull their countries out of poverty just because they were worried about a few more parts per million of fucking carbon in the air? Like, fucking, if we're worried about sea level, Holland has been underwater for 400 years. Most of Holland is under fucking sea level. And they were able to build dikes 400 years ago. Why the fuck can't we do the same thing now? Like, you know, what countries can do that? Wealthy ones. Why was Holland able to do that when they could and get the best engineers in the world and create the best engineers in the world? Because they had fucking loads of money. Why was that? Because they had a functioning economy. So first and foremost, we're looking at unintended consequences. Where would you rather live in an event of a natural disaster? Would you rather live in a third world country or a country that's struggling, a country that's poor, that can't actually get shit together? Would you rather be living in a first world country that has the resources to actually navigate a disaster if it happens, or prevent it from happening in the first place?
But Ciaran, Peterson has said this, and he's been vocal about this, and the UN has said this, and Peterson has been involved in this work with the UN, Jordan Peterson, where the best way to attack climate change is actually exactly what you said, is to develop the economy. Because if you go to a third world country, which I've been to, or developing countries, which I've been to, the amount of fucking shit on the street and in the riverways and the waterways is unbelievable. But if you go
totally understandable that that's the case as well.
Yeah, but if you go into
living day to day, like,
exactly,
it's totally understandable. They don't give a fuck about the environment.
Exactly, it's a different mindset. It's a different outlook. There are different time horizons. You go to a Western country that's highly developed and rich, like here in Western Australia. This place is like the Texas of Australia, lots of oil and gas and mining. If you went down the road here and started throwing shit on the road, people wouldn't accept that. This is a very, very clean city, right? And I know there's other cities like that as well, or other, like Singapore is another one as well. And it's exactly to your point. The proof is in the pudding. You go and see these places. Go to Dubai, any of these countries. But you go to like West Africa or other places that are developing, or maybe go somewhere in Southeast Asia, even parts of Thailand, you will just see fucking shit everywhere. Bits of rope, chicken wire, plastic. The amount of plastic you see thrown around, plastic bags, polystyrene, all these things. So if you want to change the climate and you want to feed the world, you need to get them out of poverty. That's the way to do it. And unfortunately, it's like everything. It's like with COVID, it's like with everything else, and climate change will be the same. Regardless of where you sit, money will solve the problem. And it's not about printing money, because we've seen that with the inflation issues that we've seen over the last 6 to 9 months. but it's about developing economies that are self-sustaining, to your point about Holland. And I couldn't agree with you more, Ciaran. You're bang on the money with that, so to speak.
Class,
You know,
yeah, no,
yeah.
but even for example, even a lot of the solutions um, like, and I can see some arguments against the notion that some people just might go, well, money isn't going to be, it's just going to be more technology and more. And I get that sentiment, but even with something like I find the regenerative agriculture world very interesting. I'm not a farmer myself, but I find the ideas, the concepts, and the principles that underpin it really interesting, which is working in a circular fashion with the ecosystem to generate food in such a way that you can get better at generating food across time, because you're increasing biodiversity and increasing the resiliency of the land as well. So like rotating animals across different parts of the land, making sure that it's ruminant inclusive, so that you get increased soil fertilization. You're not tilling up the soil and destroying the mycelium networks in the ground, you know. And yeah, so, but that's a lot of farmers who spend, first of all, it might not actually be viable to produce all food like that, because they might be able to produce enough food by doing that, because you're not using artificial inputs. But the land where it does make sense to do that, you then need to be able to have the money to be able to pay farmers, to educate them. Governments need to be able to do this if it's the kind of thing that they want to do, to be able to educate farmers and to be able to provide subsidies to be able to get them through the birthing process, in the learning process of how to do this new way of farming, etc. So even there needs to be, so money, a poor country may very well be forced to shift to that kind of farming. But the problem is, if you get poor very quickly, then you're much more interested in putting food on the table and feeding your family. And like a parent that is worried about putting food on the table or heating their house and has a hungry kid at home or kids will kill the last cow and cut down the last tree if it means that they'll be able to put food in their kid's stomach and heat them at night.
Yeah.
So like, as people are unable to give a shit about the environment if they're under pressure economically. And that's like the base reality. And so yeah, I just think I think we've strongly aligned on that one, obviously. But Peterson used an analogy recently, actually. I won't even, actually, let's have a future discussion, because I don't want to finish on a bleak note. But
all right, well, we will have to wrap it up there anyway, because we're out of time. So yeah, it was good catching up, man. Thanks for your time. It's good.
Yeah, it was great catch up, man.